Today I thought I'd try something a little bit different and do some introductory guides to various aspects of ancient history, Roman history in particular, and the Roman army and that sort of thing. This is partly because there have been a few requests for this, but also the video I did about the army in Judea, Pontius Pilate's bodyguard, in the 1st century AD or up until the Great Rebellion against Nero, I think made me realise that there's quite a lot of people out there who don't have even a starting knowledge of the Roman army, so that it might be useful to do an introduction about the Roman army of the sort of famous period, the Roman army we see in the reenactment groups, in the documentaries they prop up in the background doing that sort of thing on television, with the famous segmented banded armour of the legionaries and the rectangular curved shields. That look that is quintessentially Roman soldier that just about anybody can recognise. And it's been reinforced by the reenactors, but it was there already in the Hollywood image of Roman soldiers at various, regardless almost of the period. That was the look. That's what made them different from, say, a Greek hoplite or a medieval knight or whatever it might be. But they were as recognisable. So the idea of today's talk is to give an overview of the organisation and structure of the Roman army in the period of the early empire. So really we're talking from Caesar Augustus, so end of the 1st century BC, through the 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, and a little bit into the 3rd century AD. Things begin to change, the empire begins to change quite drastically in that century. But this is the classic period of, again, what we think of as the Roman army. So it's a permanent professional force. The legionaries look like the legion as we expect legionaries to appear. It's big, it's the army that is very visible, it's the army that builds camps, fortresses, monuments like Hadrian's Wall, things that we can see as sites today, sometimes as reconstructions, and it's very much, again, conforming to the look and the expectation of, like the empire itself, an apparently very modern, highly organised, highly efficient, technically skilled force with its catapults, its ballistae, its artillery, as well as its engineering skill. That's the army that people expect the Roman army to be. So let's just look at the army in that period. So we're really talking about what scholars call the Principate, the rule of one man, the princeps, because Augustus didn't call himself a king, and imperator is one of his titles as victorious general, but it doesn't have quite the connotations of our emperor, at least not at the start. So we call it the Principate, but again, early empire is fine. So really, end of the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, and into the 3rd. Now there is a fundamental division in the army into two halves at this point, as there is in Roman society, and that is between the citizens, the Roman citizens of course, and the non-citizens. And this is reflected in the shape of the army. You have the citizen components of the Roman army, which include people like the Praetorian Guard, the Emperor's bodyguard, who famously are people you can't always trust and who make and break emperors, particularly in times of disturbance and chaos. You've got the urban cohorts and the vigiles that are also based at Rome, but predominantly the citizen part of the Roman army are the legions. And again, legion is that quintessential Roman term, and people will often use it synonymously with Roman armies. They'll talk about the Roman legions marching into an area, the Roman legions putting down a rebellion, even if it wasn't necessarily a legion that was present at the time. So the Roman citizens make up this aspect of the army. It's units basically surrounding the emperor and based in Rome and a few of the other big cities, and it's the Roman legions. And the Roman legions have a very long life. You can look at my videos on the Roman legion, its earlier period in Principate, and then later on in one of the other lists on this site for more detail, and we will certainly do far more as time passes. But that's the Roman citizen part of the army, and in addition to that you have all the senior officers and quite a few officers down to middling and lower levels in all units, regardless of whether or not they were legions or others, whether the rank and file were Roman citizens. So it's an army that's officered by Romans, not entirely but predominantly, and certainly all the senior posts. As you go up, there will only be Roman citizens, and all the centurions in legion will be citizens, so you're even going down to company commander equivalents. But that's only, at best, at most, half of the Roman army, and in fact probably less than half, because most of the Roman army is composed and recruited from non-citizens, people who are provincials. They live in the provinces, the areas conquered and occupied by the Roman Empire, and they haven't yet got citizenship. And you also have sometimes people coming from outside the empire to join. So you have the non-citizens. Predominantly you have the auxiliaries, or the auxilia. Now the term means helper, supporter, that sort of thing. Now Roman armies at any period of Roman history are always just about at least half non-Roman. They're non-citizen, they're other people. The Romans have always bulked out their numbers. I suppose you could have a parallel with the British army, that it's rarely fought without allies, particularly in continental Europe or in any large wars, any large conflict. The Romans, they've always done things that way. The Roman genius is for persuading other people to join you, to feel that it's better supporting your regime, your rule, and taking a share in it and gaining some benefit from it, and then fighting against its current enemies. And they've been very good at that. That's one of the fundamental reasons why the Roman Empire is so successful. But you also have a few of the Rome units, the Equites Singulares Augusti in particular, the Emperor's Horse Guards that are formed. They go through various stages, but they take the sort of final form late in the 1st century AD and become a significant unit when emperors go on campaign, but also have a policing, controlling, protective role around the emperor when he's back in Rome or wherever he happens to be. You also have the fleets. It's probably better to say fleets plural rather than the Roman navy, because there isn't a basic separation between army and navy with wholly different career patterns. But sailors are recruited from non-citizens as a rule, although some of them are former slaves, and in some cases those people are citizens, but they are a different social group, so they fall into a different category to the fully citizen soldiers of the legions and the like. In addition to that, you have the less formal allies. Now you have units that appear to be not too closely uniformed or organised in the conventional sense of the auxilia. You get Numidian light cavalrymen, you get, they're called numeri, bands of Britons and other ethnic groups that appear, which you can see as part of the auxilia or partly allies, somewhere in between. Their status isn't quite the same. Their rights, their privileges don't seem to be the same. Their pay and training probably are not the same. But you also have, throughout much of Roman history, large numbers of communities that are allies of the Roman Empire, that are ruled by kings, perhaps dynasts, especially in the East, but not exclusively in the East, who will provide troops when required from, in some cases, semi-professional armies or professional armies, but others just levies. So a Roman force can be a mixture of all these different troop types, and that's overall the people who represent the Roman state in effect and have some military role can come from any of these groupings. So that's the broader overview. That's one big division within the Roman army, citizen and non-citizen. Then within that you've got groups that are a little bit vaguer, like the allies, like the ethnic units. There is another major distinction in that you have a clear division between the provincial armies, that is the overwhelming majority of the armed forces in the Roman Empire, and those are troops that are stationed in a province that is under the command of a Roman governor. In most cases a senator, but in a few exceptions and in smaller provinces it might be somebody else. Usually that senator is a representative of the emperor. He is a legatus, an envoy, ambassador, the word could mean the same thing, who commands a major military province. And what you tend to get is a mixture within that of one or more legions plus a similar number, perhaps a greater number of auxiliary units, and supplemented in some cases by allies depending on where you are and the local situation. So that you have a legion plus auxiliaries that are all under one command. There aren't formal brigade structures, divisional structures, as we would understand them in a modern army. However, it's quite clear from the little evidence we've got that you do appoint somebody and he has command over a section of the army, including both legionaries and auxiliaries, depending on the situation. But it probably isn't a permanent arrangement. It may be something that you there are perhaps traditions within a provincial army, but there are also, this is what you sort out for that particular operation, campaign, whatever it is you happen to be doing. Units tend to stay in one province for a long time. It's less true at the beginning when the army's moving around more. When under Augustus you have a lot more conquest and active operations that are large-scale campaigns. As the first century develops, units tend to take root and settle down, legions in particular, so that you're in a province for a long time, and you might occasionally be posted off to go and fight a war somewhere else, but you usually come back, or as time goes on you don't send the whole legion, you send what they call a vexillation, a detachment that goes off and takes part, and then again in the main returns. Occasionally troops may be transferred to join other units, but basically you tend to end up being associated with certain provinces for a long time. So there are changes, but provincial armies take on a little bit of a sort of shape of their own, an identity of their own. But they are all part of the same Roman military organisation. Centurions and any senior officers will tend to get posted between provinces. Individuals less often, though it perhaps happens at lower ranks, but certainly equestrian officers, senatorial officers, and many legionary centurions will move around the empire and move between different units during the course of a career. However, many of the rank and file and the actual units do stay in one place as their headquarters, their garrison town, for a very long time. We'll talk in another video about camps, fortresses, and all that sort of thing. You also have naval units that tend to be part of provincial armies, but we'll come back to that. We won't have time to talk too much about the Roman navy and navies and how it works today, because it's a complicated subject, and it'll require a bit too much detail than the idea of these. Then you have the units that are in Rome and Italy. Now, until late in the 2nd century AD, these units are on a permanent basis associated with the city of Rome or elsewhere. They are essentially people to help run the city of Rome and police the city of Rome, but also the imperial bodyguards. Obviously the Praetorians are the big famous component of this. You also have the equites singulares, you've got the urban cohorts that are more obviously soldiers and help to police Rome itself and its streets, and you have the vigiles that are a night police, fire brigades, or paramilitary organisation, in the same way that in some countries today there is a link between police and army, and often police have sort of semi-military uniforms but have a slightly different role. You're dealing with a group that's sort of doing that sort of thing, where it's somewhere in between the two. So it's worth mentioning it as part of the Roman military, because there isn't a clearly distinct separate police force that does everything in its own way with a purpose that is distinct from fighting wars. You also, that's why we're including them today. You've also got the fleets stationed either side of Italy. Later, at the end of the 2nd century, when Septimius Severus wins a civil war that's prompted by the murder of Commodus, he's the mad emperor in Gladiator, a legion for the first time is stationed on a near enough permanent basis in Italy, not in Rome but near Rome. Up until then, Augustus and his successors wanted to make clear, no, we're not ruling by force, we're not holding the population down because I've got the biggest army. That's why the Praetorian Guard, as we'll see, was kept deliberately to appear to be smaller than a legion. However, Septimius Severus, less secure, more likely to go on campaign, established his Legio II Parthica not far from Rome. And it adds to it. It starts to turn the Rome and Italian garrison into something equivalent to a provincial army. So, let's look at the first part, so we're dealing with citizen component, and let's look at the legions. Augustus comes to power as a result of the latest in a series of civil wars. Caesar had fought Pompey, Caesar had been murdered, Mark Antony and Octavian, the man who'd become Augustus, fought each other. They joined together, they fought against Brutus and Cassius, then they fought each other again, and eventually, 30 BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra kill themselves. Caesar Augustus, he'll become as the last man standing, and he creates the Principate, the rule of emperors, the rule of the Caesars, as we understand it, in this new system. When those wars end, there's about 60 legions knocking around, some of them probably quite small in size, that have been raised by the different sides during the war. Augustus really establishes the Roman army as a permanent professional force. There have been trends towards this beforehand, but he sits down and says, well, this is the size it's going to be, this is the sort of shape it's going to be, and this, to some extent, at the moment anyway, where it's going to be. He settles on 28 permanent legions. They each get a number and a name, a title, so 2nd Augusta, 5th Alaudi, 20th, seems to get the titles Bedoyere Victrix probably later on in the century. Not everyone has a title at the start, and there is talk in our sources of one legion losing its honorary title of Augusta because it's misbehaved on campaign. However, you've obviously got pre-existing traditions within these legions and sense of identity, which means this isn't a logical system. It isn't just numbers 1 to 28, sometimes with a name. Instead, you get several 1st legions, 2nd legions, 3rd legions, 4th legions, 5th legions. After that, you tend only to get one with the same number in most cases, but it means you don't have a complete sequence. Again, this is probably a sensible thing. You've got these legions with a strong corporate identity. That means they'll fight better, therefore better to keep it, better to use that for your own benefit. So there's duplication. In AD 9, 3 legions, 17, 18 and 19, none of which appear to have a title, in addition to their number, are destroyed in Germany in the rebellion led by Arminius and defeated under the command of Varus. They're destroyed. These numbers are never reused. Those units are never reformed. So the army drops to only 25 legions for a while, but over the course of the 1st century, emperors will raise new ones, and although there are a few other legions that disappear through perhaps defeat in battle, or at war serious defeat where there's not enough left to put the unit back together or where it's misbehaved, but also where units have chosen the wrong side during the civil war following Nero's death in 68-69. Nevertheless, by the early 2nd century, end of the 1st century, there seem to be 30 legions. So it's gone up, goes back to 28, then it goes up to 30. And one indication of this is that the Emperor Trajan forms a 30th legion, Ulpia Victrix as it will become, that suggests that that's the total at the time. And that number, it stays pretty much around that number until the end of the 2nd century. Septimius Severus will raise 3 more. There have been new legions raised, but there also seem to have been other legions that disappear. Famously, Legio IX Hispana vanishes at some point in the 2nd century, probably early 2nd century. That's a talk for another day, or we might see if we can interview somebody who's written on that and talk about it. So basically, by the time you've got to the 2nd century, you've got 30. For most of the 1st century, it will be at or near 28. So that's an indication of the size. Now let's look at each individual legion. Its commander is a legatus legionis, a legionary legate, who's a senator, usually in his early 30s. And this is one stage in a career that sees him holding both military and civil jobs, posts as we would understand them. If the legion is the only legion within the province, then often this man will combine the role of governor with command of the legion. There is a trend. Earlier under Augustus and the Julio-Claudians, some provinces will have as many as 4 legions stationed in them. Over time, and particularly by the 2nd century, this is seen as a little bit too concerning, a bit too worrying and dangerous by the emperors, and it tends to end up with no legion having more than 2, no province having more than 2 legions on a regular basis. You've then got the senior tribune, the broad-striped tribune, the Laticlavius, who is an aspiring senator. He's somebody in his late teens, maybe early 20s, who is embarking on this senatorial career, but at that stage has not yet been enrolled formally as a senator. But in the majority of cases, he's going to be from a senatorial family. So these are people from the elite of the Roman Empire. There are about 600 senators at the time, so again, this is quite a significant individual, both politically and socially, within the Roman Empire, and he is commanding each legion, with the exception of the legions in Egypt that are commanded by equestrians. But again, we'll look at Egypt separately one day, because it breaks so many rules and it does things in this different way and has different sorts of evidence that it's easier to talk about it that way. You then have the Praefectus Castrorum, the prefect of the camp. He is an equestrian. Now, the equestrians are the next social class below the Senate, and there are at least tens of thousands of them. They are important, rich significant individuals. They are the local gentry in many cities, in many rural areas, and they're obviously Roman citizens of high standing, but they're not as important as senators, and they're far more numerous. Usually this man is an experienced former centurion who's reached the pinnacle of the centurion's career, been primus pilus, become an equestrian at that stage, held other equestrian military and political posts, and then got this as... there is some debate over who is sort of formally second in command of the legion, whether it's the tribune on the basis of not his age or experience, but his social status, the senior tribune, or whether it's the prefect. I think sometimes the argument is a little too rigid, but nevertheless, that's something for another day. You then have 5 other tribunes. These are, we could call them junior, but that's probably wrong. They're the narrow stripe tribunes, the Angusti Clavier, these are equestrians who are younger men than the prefect of the camp. These are people who have generally been born equestrians, and they are following a different career path. For most periods, there is a brief exception under Claudius, these people have already commanded an auxiliary cohort, perhaps more than one, for several years before they move to a legion and become one of 5 of these narrow stripe tribunes. So these are people with more military experience than the senatorial tribune, though still not vast amounts of it, and they will go on from this to command a cavalry, auxiliary cavalry unit in Arla. Age-wise, hard to say then. Probably many of them would be men in their 20s. We estimate 3 years in post for command of an auxiliary cohort, though that's not based on an awful lot of hard evidence. It's guesswork and some assumptions based on a series of inscriptions from forted northern Britain that people looking at now are not quite so sure some of those assumptions are so clear-cut as that. But nevertheless, a few years seems reasonable for one of these postings, and some may have done more. But they are probably comparatively young men, though a little bit older than the senatorial tribune, the broad-striped tribune. Below them you have 59 to 60, probably centurions. Centurion, again, is a grade of officer, not a formal rank. So there are distinctions of rank within the centurionate. The numbering, the total is a little bit uncertain. We get the figure of 60 in some sources, but of course, you know, people could be rounding up 59. We know definitely of 59 posts as centurion in most legions of what we think is the most common organisation for a legion. There's a possibility that there was another centurion in charge of the small unit of cavalry that belonged to each legion. But there is doubt, and there may have been a little bit of variation. Broadly speaking, that's the pattern. About 60 is probably as good a way of any. So let's look at the legion's organisation itself. The legion is broken up into 10 cohorts, and for much of the time, the first cohort seems to be larger than the rest and may number about 800 men. Again, that's its theoretical strength, its paper strength. How often units actually had what they were supposed to have every day of the year in real life is always arguable with any army at any time. And then cohorts 2 to 10 had the standard organisation of 480 each. In the case of the first cohort, there are 5 centurions. In every other cohort there are 6 with a century of 80 men. The first cohort has double strength centuries of 160. We also hear of the contubernium, which is the tent companions, the group of 8 men who are described in one source as sharing a tent on campaign. Now this seems to fit broadly anyway with the pattern of barrack rooms and the layout of barrack blocks in permanent bases. And we use the terms like contubernalis, you know, comrade, tent companion, male mucker sort of thing are quite common. However, one thing that's worth saying, we often think, oh, that shows how advanced the Romans are. Section of 8 men. And then we assume that this group not only eats together, sleeps together, does the rounds of sentry duty, stag, you know, this sort of thing, in turn based around that group of 8. Lives together in a room in a barrack block or pair of rooms. that it's like a modern section, and it might be used almost as a tactical element, that you might send a contubernium to do something, you might position them where they stand in the formation of the unit when it's in on parade or in battle, will be based on which contubernium they're in. All of those things are possible. There is not a shred of evidence for the contubernium ever being used in a unit in that way. Now, it's a nice coincidence, if not more, that the Romans choose 8, which is pretty much standard in NATO armies for some time, as the basic infantry rifle squad rifle section, because of studies that suggested the group of 8 bond together as one, whereas larger groups tend to split into more than one. And maybe the Romans had worked all this out, and maybe that's what they do. However, what you'll sometimes get, and you'll find it in some fiction set in the Roman period, you know, the people will send a contubernium or a couple of contubernia to do something. There isn't actually evidence for that. It may have worked in a slightly different way, something again we will talk about on another day. Within the legion you also have 120 cavalry, possibly under a centurion, probably in 4 troops termi of 30 odd. Now, we assume that the larger first cohort and the 120 cavalry are standard in most legions most of the time in this period, but the evidence doesn't actually confirm that, and nobody really sits down and tells us in detail this is what every unit was like and how it had to be. There may have been some variation. You also have artillery, you have specialists. These don't seem to be organised in any separate units on a permanent basis. Like the cavalry, the men who belong to these parts of the legion seem to have been enrolled and carried on the books of a century, and then just called off to perform their specific tasks. So for basic administrative purposes, they're listed as belonging to the century of so-and-so, the name of the centurion in charge. You also have veterans, men who've served 20 years out of their 25, and from that point on are exempt from fatigue, some other duties, sort of, you know, basically given lighter duties, but they're still required to fight. We're told in defense of the base. Now, whether that means they would actively go on campaign, or whether they would, there's certainly, we see some in Numidia in the early 1st century AD being employed as a garrison force and coming under attack. Veterans seem to be a separate unit then. Some people have suggested that the enlargement of the first cohort is because you're putting the veterans into it after you've changed from having this pattern, so that it's not just the prestigious unit in terms of size, but it's got your most experienced soldiers. Vegetius, who of course is writing right at the end of the Western Roman Empire, around about the year 400, he claims that you had to be a little bit taller to be in the first cohort compared to the rest of the legion, which could be another sense of status. You know, you've got your bigger, more impressive men that look good on parade and are more frightening to the enemy and perhaps physically stronger in that unit, like a grenadier company in an 18th or 19th century infantry battalion or regiment. But there is so much we don't know. So the bottom there, you've got the total of circa 5,240 for the full theoretical strength. Again, always remember that reality is unlikely to be as neat, of a legion at that size. That's including all those elements, but of course it means we're not including veterans as a separate group, or we're not quite sure if there are any other additional corniculari and others, clerks and administrators in the headquarters. So there is an element of doubt where, you know, in the same way we say about 60 centurions, a legion is in theory 5,000 plus, but we can't get too precise as to exactly how many men there were supposed to be, even assuming that every legion had exactly the same order of battle at every time. Within the cohorts themselves, the centurions are given particular titles depending on where their century, where its status is within the unit. So cohorts 2 to 10, you've got the senior one is the pilus prior, followed by the pilus posterior, princeps prior, princeps posterior, hastatus prior, hastatus posterior. The names have been derived from the old Republican system where people served depending on their age. So the veterans were the triarii or the pili, who were at the rear of the formation, sort of ultimate reserve. That tradition continues. Clearly there is a seniority within that. Less clear whether there's seniority between, say, the 10th cohort and the 6th cohort in a unit. The first cohort is clearly superior, at least more prestigious to all. these centurions in the first cohort get equestrian status. In a permanent base, they get their own individual house rather than a suite of rooms at the end of a barrack block. You have the primus pilus is the senior centurion of the legion. Then you've got the princeps posterior, hastatus posterior. Again, these are double strength centuries. However, there's also some indication that these men are getting posted off to do more important tasks, so they may not always be in charge of their century or physically present all the time. And that's true of a lot of centurions. They get sent to do things, which means that subordinates are actually running the company on an everyday basis. Again, I've already done one on centurions' careers, but I'll do more on that in the future, so we won't go into that today. But that's basically your main grade of officers in charge of the legions are the centurions. They differ in status and probably rewards, pay, prestige, certainly, and authority. There is a fair chance that just by their individual seniority combined with the post in which they serve, that the Romans could always work out as a centurion, okay, well, who's in charge at the moment. But also, bear in mind, these things do seem to have reflected where the unit would form up on parade and to some extent when it was deployed in the battle line as well. So it's part of a structure that allows the legion to function. There is no direct evidence from our sources that the senior centurion present, or the pilus prior if everybody's present, or the primus pilus, actually commands the cohort in battle. There is no source tells us that the cohort had a commander at all. Logic would suggest that it does, and that it presumably is the pilus prior or the most senior man present. Otherwise, whether senior on the basis of his individual service record or senior on the basis of which post he occupied, there just isn't the evidence to explain that. It's pretty clear Julius Caesar, for instance, just issues orders to centurions and orders cohorts around and uses them as tactical units. That does suggest that there's a commander. It doesn't make much sense if you're having to explain to 6 people all the time, this is what I want you to do. Again, we'll look at command structure of the Roman army and its role in battle in more detail elsewhere. But the impression is from the sources that somebody does command the cohort, but no one actually tells us who it is. But this system seems to be set up to create a hierarchy, therefore it's logical that within it it was abundantly clear to the Romans who was in charge and who was giving the orders. So that's the legion organisation. Then let's stick with the provincial armies for the moment before we go and look at the Rome units. You have the auxilia, the non-citizens. So let's start with them, the formal, regular auxilia. Now, these are divided into obviously infantry and cavalry very clearly, but there are also mixed units that contain some infantry and a small proportion of cavalry, usually a ratio of about 4:1. So you have, broadly speaking, the infantry are in cohorts of 480 or 800, so very, very similar, the same size as the legionary cohorts, with some units, some auxiliary units being more prestigious and larger and being the same size as the first cohort of a legion. Cavalry ally are very similar but not quite as neat. You have the Ala of 512 being the basic unit, and then the double strength of probably around about 760 rather than 800. Commanders in every case are equestrians, and for infantry units that's your first posting. Then you go to a legion as an aristrite tribune. Then if you're trusted you become commander of a cavalry ala, and that's the 3 stages of the classic equestrian military career. But there are exceptions, and to get command of the double strength cavalry unit in particular tends to only follow after you've already commanded an ordinary size one. So let's look in slightly more detail at the makeup of these. Now these are referred to as quingenaria or miliaria, quinguinarium military if you want to anglicize it. The quinguinary cohort is 480, as I said, divided into 6 centuries of 80, so very much like a legionary cohort in every respect. The military cohort is 800, but rather than having the 5 centuries, double-sized centuries of a legionary first cohort,
there's just about enough evidence to suggest that it was more likely to have 10 ordinary size centuries. Not, it's not absolutely certain. When it was a cohors equitata, one of these mixed cohorts, a cohort but with cavalry, the quinquennary was, again, 480 in 6 centuries plus 120 in 4 termi, or troops, of about 30. And the miliary cohort 800 in 10 and 240 in 8. So the century is about 80, the terma about 30. Again, as with all these things, these are paper theoretical strengths, not at all what you're likely to have on a day-to-day basis, and unit records and strength returns suggest the whole thing is messier. There is also it's taking us well into the 3rd century, but from Dura Europus in Syria, there are records of a mixed cohort, a miliary mixed cohort of Palmyrines that were also archers. They seem to have troops of about 60. So it might be that these suggested numbers weren't always true everywhere all the time, and that units vary depending on the situation, or it could be a trend towards larger subunits of cavalry by this period. Very hard to know. Just that this is our best guess, but the evidence suggests reality was probably a bit more complicated. But this at least gives us a good guide that is broadly true and seems to be reflected in the layout of a lot of Roman army bases. The quinquennary ala was 512 men divided into 16 troops of 32. Seem to be slightly larger, though not for any reason we can understand. When it's miliary, then it's 768 in 32. So again, those suggest a terma of 32 as opposed to 30, and it might be to do with how you're counting officers, junior leaders, that sort of thing. But that's, broadly speaking, the pattern. So that's how auxiliary cohorts work. Now, overall, there are at least as many auxiliaries as there are legionaries. This is something Tacitus talks about early in the 1st century, and seems to be always true, but actually there is a trend towards increasing number of auxiliary units to the point where they start to outnumber the legions. They're not by a vast margin, but the auxiliaries are at least half the army. Now, auxiliary troops provide some roles that the legion isn't so well organised to provide itself. The legionary is essentially a heavy infantryman. He wears body armour. You've famously got the segmented armour, but there's evidence for legionaries wearing mail and scale armour as well. There's no direct evidence for auxiliaries wearing the segmented armour. They carry a shield that is sometimes oval, but quite often rectangular, always curved, always semi-cylindrical, as we call it. They wield the pilum, this heavily, sometimes weighted throwing spear, used at close range, but very good at penetrating shield, armour, and the person behind them. But you had to have the discipline to wait until the last minute and throw it then. And they wear the Gladius sword and use that. Helmets, Tacitus implies in one short passage that there was a clear distinction between legionary and auxiliary patterns of equipment. It's harder to tell that archaeologically. Generally, we tend to sort of assume the fancier stuff is legionary. However, monuments like Trajan's Column represent the distinction between legions and Praetorian Guards as well, who are sometimes on there, and auxiliaries as very distinct. Now, obviously, a lot of auxiliaries are cavalry. You only have at most 120 legionary cavalry in each legion. It's not a major force in a unit of 5,000. It can do its job, but it's not a major cavalry element. So the auxiliaries provide the bulk of the horsemen that allow Roman field armies to be good, balanced forces with a mix of different troop types. Some of them come in the prestigious cavalry ala themselves, that are just cavalry units, and these men are better paid. There was more money spent on the quality of their equipment and their mounts as well. So these are prestigious units. The cavalry of the cohorts are a little bit cheaper, but they're very much the sort of working horsemen of the Roman army. They're very useful for patrolling, escort duty, all the little things where you just need a few horsemen. And in a sense, a cohors equitata is a sort of mini army. It's got its cavalry, it's got its infantry. If there's a small problem to deal with, you can send it and it can deal with it on its own. So it's sort of microcosm of the Roman army. You have cavalry, again, of high quality, and there is a tendency, partly a reflection of the defeats by Hannibal always to think of the Romans as essentially infantrymen and with a sort of foot soldiers mentality, and that the rise of cavalry only occurs later in the 3rd century and 4th century and beyond, when the Romans start to become good horsemen. That's not true. The army of the empire includes a lot of cavalry. They're very expensive. They're very prestigious. Again, note that as an an equestrian officer, you serve an auxiliary cohort first, then a legion, and only then get given command of a cavalry unit. So these are, it's easy to mess up and neglect the quality of your horses and your mounts and your training. To be a good cavalry soldier requires all the training to be a horseman and a rider, as well as all the tactical and weapons training that is required elsewhere. So it takes a bit longer to train a good cavalryman and to replace them when they're lost than it does an infantryman. So these are prestigious units. So that's clearly a specialist role that supplements the legions with a form of fighting that it isn't capable of doing on its own. You also have archers. There are units that are Sagittari. They are clearly designated as archers in their title. Perhaps in some cases in the East that's just a word for soldier, and they may not be 100% archers, but nevertheless significant numbers of cohorts are designated as archers and are presumably predominantly, perhaps exclusively, armed with bows. And these are high quality composite bows. We can see traces of the bow laths and components of this from many sites. The Romans have copied basically the sort of best bow technology around and mass produce it in the way that the Romans do with lots of equipment. So you have missile troops that, again, the legions are not provided with long-range missiles used by an ordinary soldier. They have the artillery component, though again Vegetius comment that there's one bolt shooter per century and one larger stone thrower per cohort. That's the only evidence for that allocation. It may have varied a lot more than that. So you have archers. Monuments and archaeological evidence suggest the sling is in use, but there are no units designated as fundatores, as slingers. So either you just it wasn't worth giving a title, or it's only a proportion of men within a unit that are using slings, or in certain circumstances they are using slings, or that the slingers we see on Trajan's column that aren't given armour and the sort of formal auxiliary panoply are allied or irregular troops, ethnic troops. We don't know is the main answer to that. However, there is a tendency you will get in particularly older books to describe auxiliary infantrymen. The mass of the auxilia are cohorts that are armed with a flat shield, but quite a big body shield, often oval, sometimes rectangular, hexagonal, but predominantly oval. They have body armour, usually mail, sometimes scale. They have a bronze or iron helmet, and they carry a Gladius sword. They have not the pilum, but a spear, hasta, a lancia, variations of spears more suited to thrusting, throwing, or a combination of both. There is a tendency to describe these as light infantry, as somehow supplementing the legions with a skirmishing capability that the close order heavy infantry legionaries lacked. This is not based on ancient evidence. This is simply a modern assumption. It is possible there are references to light armed troops, Levis Armatura, that crop up at various stages, that some auxiliary units didn't have body armour, or had some or all of their men were not quite so heavily equipped. The equipment of the standard auxiliary isn't that of a skirmisher. This is of somebody who is going to fight in close order, at close range, and fight their way through, as the historian Tacitus describes the Batavian and Tungrian cohorts doing at Battle of Mons Graupius in sort of circa 84 AD, where they use the classic Roman fighting technique: punch the enemy in the face with your shield boss, stab him while he's unbalanced, stab him in the guts or face or wherever, whichever way you can, and then just keep grinding forward. So most auxiliaries are actually close order heavy infantrymen most of the time, just like legionaries. And in each case, each troop type can do other things as well if the situation requires, though of course their equipment may not be ideally suited to that, but they can be issued with other stuff, or they can adapt. So what the auxiliary provides is far less skirmishing capability, light armed troops. There is some of that, but most of the troops are simply extra bodies, extra manpower, extra people who are interchangeable with the legions in most respects. And probably to many of your opponents, the difference between a legionary with his segmented armour and his pilum to an auxiliary with his armour and his oval shield and his throwing spear, but he's still got a helmet, he's still got the gladius sword, he's got all this kit, and he's very well trained at how to use it. The difference was probably not that obvious. Josephus, for instance, the Jewish historian, will refer to both auxiliaries and legionaries as hoplites quite often. So there is unfortunately a lot of translations of, for the Penguin Classics and sometimes the Lerb series, you will get the expression expeditor, which means moving without baggage, without heavy kit, as light, or as light troops, as a column, when what it means is you've stripped a column down to the bare minimum of baggage, and the soldiers are carrying the bare minimum of their personal kit, just basically what they need to fight and what they need to survive for a short period, and therefore they march faster. That's what expeditor means. It doesn't mean light troops in the sense we tend to assume of lighter equipment, more open order in the way they fight. So the auxiliary predominantly provides, it fleshes out the Roman army, provides a lot more manpower, so it means you can do more things, you can secure and control more areas of the empire. So that's the regular parts of the provincial army. The ethnic units, the numeri, are a sort of ambiguous somewhere in between. They are probably semi-permanent, they're paid by the Romans. Formal auxiliaries get, at the end of the 25 years service, Roman citizenship. So if you've been in a cohort or an ale, you serve through and you're honourably discharged at the end, you become a Roman citizen, at least for most of the first century and most of the second century. Later on it starts to change a little bit, and the rights get reduced to some extent, but by then there are more citizens around, and eventually by the 3rd century there'll be the universal grant of citizenship, or virtually universal, so that most soldiers and auxiliary units are also Roman citizens by that time. But that's an army that's changed significantly. The numeri don't seem to get these rights. They don't get as much pay. They don't get the formal equipment provided by the state, or at least they do it stylized to look different and represent them. But again, there is much less evidence about them than there is about the formal auxilia. With the auxilia we have tombstones, we have forts we've excavated, we've got more sense of their equipment there, depicted more on monuments like Trajan's Column, Adam Clissi and elsewhere, and they're described far more in our sources, so we get a better sense of them from that. But that's basically the provincial armies. You've then got the Rome units. We'll only do this briefly because, again, this is a topic that deserves a talk of its own. Predominantly you have the Praetorian Guard. That's the prestigious unit, the most significant politically and to some extent militarily, commanded by 2 prefects. No emperor who was sensible wanted to trust one man with sole command of his bodyguard, just in case that man got ideas. There are periods when it happens, but they're usually a sign of things going wrong. Those prefects are equestrians, and they've usually come through aspects of the equestrian career, though to get to be in charge of one of the Rome units, things were often a little bit different. They consist of 9 cohorts. That's what Augustus establishes, and it probably no coincidence it's 9, not 10. So when you're saying I've ended civil war and I'm ruling because I'm the best servant of the state and I'm not ruling by force, Augustus shows people, well, I have less than a legion. I don't have a legion with me to keep control. I don't need that. I'm not frightened. I'm beloved of the people. I just need a few people to keep order in the city when there's a riot or that sort of thing. He also tended to have only 3 cohorts in Rome at a time. Under Tiberius, all 9 are brought there, and they tend to stay there from then on. Seem to start at standard legionary size, 480 men in a cohort, increases to 800, perhaps even formally to 1,000. Because the units, the expressions quinguinary and miliary mean 500 and 1,000, but they don't actually mean that in terms of the organisation, as far as we can see of, say, auxiliary units. We're never quite sure when the Romans talk about 1,000-strong unit in other contexts, whether they really mean 1,000 this time, or whether they mean about 800, 760, that sort of thing, brought in that area. These are equipped, as far as we can tell, in very similar style to the legions, but they have a lot of fancier equipment. They have standards that are more ornate, too heavy to carry on the march, this sort of thing sometimes. And there's some indication of this from sculptures and the like. You have the urban cohorts that will eventually, there'll be 9 of these as well. These are very much a sort of paramilitary police force to control the city. There's also 1 unit in Lugdunum, Lyon, where there's an imperial mint for a long time. So these are troops to then They do occasionally end up on campaign under certain emperors, but they're not really designed for that. These are these are internal control units rather than frontier fighting forces. You then have the Vigiles. Say there's 7 cohorts, each of again 1,000, perhaps really 1,000, perhaps 800 or so. In each case, you've got tribunes and centurions, whether it's praetorians, urban cohorts, Vigiles. So you've got a similar rank structure to elsewhere. The organisation, the terminology is very similar. There is a cavalry element to the Praetorian Guard from early on, and then you have the Equites Singulares Augusti added late 1st century. They seem to be 1,000 strong again. Is that literal or proximate? Praetorian cavalry numbers may have varied considerably from sort of Ala sized to double Ala sized. Seem to be a proportion of ordinary cohorts, so it's a bit like the legionary cavalry. The men seem to be enrolled in a century, but on detached duty, and there's some indication of you serve several years just an ordinary soldier before you can be admitted to the cavalry. That seems to happen in many cases in the cohorts equitatae as well. Cohortes equitatae, I'm going to be correct. That in a mixed cohort you sort of serve your apprenticeship in the infantry, and once you've got good conduct and some ability and you either can ride or you're willing to learn and the army's willing to train you, you get transferred to the slightly better paid, more prestigious cavalry. But again, there's quite a lot of evidence about the Rome units, but it's more complicated. It breaks a lot of the rules of that we expect in the provincial armies, so it's something that's easier to talk about at another time. Again, the Equites Singulares Augusta seem to be recruited from the pick of the cavalry of the provincial armies. So people come, they're not a single ethnic group, though earlier on there'd been a lot of Germans within them, and they seem to keep the nickname Batavians. Even after that's not true, but you get men from all over, and the idea is this is supposed to be the sort of pick of the bunch. There is some indication of men getting promoted either from the Praetorians to become legionary centurions or go back to as troop leaders to the cavalry if you've been in the Singulares. How common that was is much harder to say. It probably wasn't a major aspect of their role, but it's there nevertheless. So let's come round, and we won't again talk too much about the Allies, which is the remaining element, because this varies a lot in period and time. But if you look at someone like Josephus' account of the Jewish rebellion and interventions before, the Roman armies that march into Judea have large components from allied kingdoms like Commagene and other communities, and they raise troops, levies in some of the sort of semi-autonomous cities. So you get these, and these levies will vary from a mob of people out to loot and to exercise their dislike of the Jewish community or whichever community happens to be in rebellion, as just pursuing their existing rivalries, and people who are being given some more training, turning into slightly more useful, more efficient soldiers rather than just a sort of mob of hangers-on and people to fetch and carry and to bulk out your force. A lot of these kingdoms, a lot of these dynasts have these professional armies, many of them modelled on the Roman system, some with some Hellenistic trends continuing, that these can provide contingents that will serve in the Roman army. And particularly the ones that are already organised on the Roman fashion, it's obviously easier to sort of include them, to bolt them into the Roman command structure. You get tribal levies elsewhere as well, where depending on where you are, and the boundary between irregular units, scouts, and so often people are only attested on one inscription or in one source that we don't really know enough about them, and it's impossible to estimate numbers and that sort of thing. The idea that the entire empire was formally disarmed isn't generally held these days. There are times when there are restrictions on obviously what weapons you can certainly wear in public, but also what you're allowed to produce, what you're allowed to purchase, but these are pretty limited. On the whole, because there aren't formal police forces in many parts of the empire, or fire brigades, because these are seen as dangerous, nevertheless there are some areas that have their sort of constabularies, particularly in some Greek cities. You have people to guard the prisons, this sort of thing. But these are small in numbers. Occasionally these will get swept up and end up serving as soldiers. But it's it's a complicated picture. There is nowhere near enough evidence to sort of judge how normal this is. It is something that happens. You sometimes do raise levies. There are allied contingents that assist the Roman army at times when required from provincial populations. We just don't know very much about them, and they seem to be sort of often quite temporary in their nature. So let's come and round things up by looking at the overall size of the army. We've looked at the different components, we've looked at the distinction between citizen and non-citizen, between provincial armies, Roman and Italian units, and the various types of unit within the army. If you play with some numbers and add them together, you've got 30 legions, say, if we go with the 2nd century figure, about 5,000 men supposedly in each legion. That gives you 150,000 legionaries at any one time. The rule of thumb is that there are at least as many auxiliaries and perhaps more. Certain provinces, Britain for instance, as the 2nd century goes on, seems to have more auxiliaries than it does legionaries, by about maybe 25%. Other provinces it's slightly different. Occasionally it's lower, but that's quite rare. So if we assume a similar or greater number of auxiliaries, if we add in the Rome units, we add in the sailors, you're probably adding a 200,000 plus. So rule of thumb for the army of, say, Hadrian's day, Marcus Aurelius's day, would be 350,000 as the theoretical strength, what the army should have. Again, unit rosters make it clear that many units were significantly under strength quite often for a lot of the time, and that's not unusual. And it is a pattern that whenever a major campaign develops where the Romans have warning, they have a dilectus, a levy, they recruit more troops quickly, they try and sort of boost the army. Like most governments, they probably don't like paying for soldiers that they feel aren't doing things all the time, and they don't worry too much. It's probably rarer for the officer posts not to be filled, because these perform an important role for the equestrian order, for the senatorial order, and for people below the equestrian order but aspiring to join it, that may be centurions and the like. And there's good pay and prestige with all of these posts. So those are probably filled most of the time, but they may well not often have all the soldiers they're supposed to have under their command actually physically present and enlisted. Rule of thumb for population of the empire, the figure that's often bandied around, has been for a few decades, is sort of 60 million or so. So you can see the proportion of the army in relation to that. I suspect that 60 million is too low. You might be pushing more towards 70, but it's very hard to prove these things. I think gradually the accumulation of archaeological evidence will tend to push our estimates higher. But there again, you have then in the Antonine Plague under Marcus Aurelius, devastating loss of life, at least that's how it's presented, amongst civilian population, particularly the soldiers, because they're concentrated in barracks just like people crammed together in cities. So there would be times when that perhaps is less true, at least in the short term, and overall there might well be significant decline. So the Roman army is big, and it's very large by the standards of organised permanent armies, really before the late 18th, 19th centuries in a European context. This 350,000 is a lot of people, and it's a lot of people in proportion to 60 million plus, but it is still not a heavily militarised state. There are large parts of the Roman Empire that don't see Roman soldiers, certainly don't see organised formations of Roman soldiers, because most of these troops, you've got the stuff in Italy, around Rome, most of the rest are concentrated around the frontier provinces. And you have small numbers of troops that help the governors do their jobs elsewhere. So you can generally see from this that this is not an empire that is holding down its population entirely by force. However, this is still a significant body of armed men, and force is a component within people coming to accept Roman rule. Rather than thinking of rebelling, there is that danger. The reprisals that will happen to you if you rebel are pretty nasty, so you do have to think twice. And generally speaking, the pattern of rebellion is you get one sort of fairly early, within a generation or so of conquest, maybe another one, but then that's it. It's fairly stable, with some exceptions. But even Judea is quiet after Hadrian in terms of mass rebellion. That doesn't happen again for various reasons that are too detailed to go into today. And there is not a pattern of indigenous rebellion against the state and Roman rule that continues right the way through the Roman period. That sense of identity seems to be lost. People accept the fact that they're Roman and part of that system. And the army plays a role in that, partly because all these people coming through the auxilia are getting citizenship at the end of their service, so they are becoming Romans. So even people at a relatively humble level of society are becoming part of the Roman state and getting these legal privileges and coming in many respects, but not all, to identify with the Roman state, at least to some extent. So the Roman army is big, it's highly organised, it's able to post units all around the empire, it's able to post individuals all around the empire, it's able to support them, it does have this weaponry, this technology. If you think a standard auxiliary soldier, let alone a legionary, with his body armour, his high quality sword, his helmet, his shield, his spear, he's equipped as well as most chieftains and elite warriors in an Iron Age society. And that's everybody in the unit. So you've sort of mass-produced the best of military systems from elsewhere. And you've taken on, yes, you come up against the Parthians and the Alans and the Sarmatians who are skirmishing horse archers, cataphracts, that sort of thing. The Roman army copies it, gets their own. So the Romans do learn from mistakes, they do adapt. There's a lot of variation, but this is a highly successful force. It's a very large, sophisticated force, but like any human institution, it also sometimes is messy, sometimes is confused, sometimes is less than perfectly efficient, often doesn't conform to the theoretical image of what it should be like, and its levels of training, its manpower, all of these sorts of things. But there we go. That's a basic guide, hopefully, fairly basic, though as usual I've gone on longer than I planned, about the Roman army that maybe is of use to people who are starting out or just want to sort of refresh their sense of, okay, what's around in, as I say, in the late 1st century BC, 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, and a little bit into the 3rd, though as times will change then. So there we are, first of our back to basics, Roman army, its organisation in the heyday of the Roman Empire. Thanks for listening.